when they came home to real land, their father, he said, "How is it that you have returned so early today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. And moreover, when they came home to real land, their father, he said, 'How is it that you have returned so early today?' They said, 'An Egyptian delivered us.'"
Sorry.
Oh, we'll begin in verse 18 there. And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and moreover, he drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him so that he may eat bread." Moses was content to live with the man. He gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter. She bore a son, and he named him Gershom, because he said, "I have lived as an exile in a foreign land." Now let's turn over to chapter 3 and begin at verse 11. Chapter 3, verse 11. We read, "The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, and I know their sorrows. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the area where the Canaanites, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite reside. Now behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come up to me. Moreover, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" So Moses really felt like a nobody there. Then one more verse to look at, chapter 10, or chapter 4 and verse 10. Exodus 4:10. We read, "Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before now nor since thou hast spoken to thy servant, and I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue." So, thinking that we're nobody, of course, is a complete opposite to thinking we're somebody. And let us understand that it is not for the purpose of discouraging us or depressing us or making us feel good for nothing that God sometimes causes us to feel like nobodies. On the contrary, God wants us to find joy in serving Him, and He attributes great value to us in His sight, by grace, of course. We read such verses as, "Serve the Lord with gladness, come before His presence with singing," or "Rejoice in the Lord always, again I say rejoice," or "The joy of the Lord is your strength," or "You have been precious and honored in my sight, and I have loved you." So let's beware of what they call the woke mentality. It tries to make you feel that if any ancestors of you committed great evils, that then you should always feel depressed and practically regret your existence. Well, that kind of mentality doesn't accomplish anything good, and it's not what the Word of God teaches. Nor must we take our incapacities as an excuse not to do anything in God's service, because as we'll see, Moses did fall into that trap for a short time. God got him out of it, because God is glorified by showing what He can do through us. But what learning to nobody is supposed to accomplish is that to make us and keep us mindful of our absolute dependence on the Lord. Because Christ said, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." But Paul wrote, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." So yes, totally helpless to accomplish anything on our own, but with Christ living in us to give us strength, He can do great, wonderful things. And God may put us through a time of feeling like nobodies for that purpose. And at the same time, it helps us to grasp something of Christ's humiliation when we're made to feel like nobodies, because He left the glories of heaven to live in poverty on earth, and He accepted our human limits, and He was slighted by many people. Well, Moses got a taste of that kind of humiliation and he actually became a type of Christ in his humiliation. So, when do we feel like nobodies, or when do we tend to? Well, we tend to feel like nobodies when we're estranged from everything that's familiar to us. So we wonder, well, what am I doing here? I can't fit in. So we feel like nobodies. When Moses learned that his killing of the Egyptian was commonly known, and maybe even that Pharaoh was planning to kill him, when he learned that, he fled to Midian. Actually, when he tried to make peace between the two Jews who were fighting, and he said, please, why are you harming your brother? And then the Jew who was in the wrong in that fight asked Moses, who do you think you are? Do you plan to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? Yes, the man did that out of resentment. He resented Moses trying to correct him, but actually the Lord was using him to do Moses a favor, because otherwise, how would Moses have found out that his killing the Egyptian was known and that he needed to flee? So the Lord had his hand on Moses even there, and he fled to Midian. Now, Midian is in the Arabian Peninsula, and it was on the way from Egypt to the Promised Land, to which the Lord wanted to bring his people Israel. But it was there that Moses was estranged from the land that God had promised to Israel, and he was estranged from the province of Goshen in Egypt, where the Israelites lived at present, where his family lived. He was estranged from fellow Israelites, including all his blood relatives, and he was estranged even from the royal family who had adopted him. So estranged from everybody who had any connection with him. And he was also estranged from the way of life that he was used to. The rural life of the Midianites would certainly be very different from life in the palace of Egypt. And he was estranged geographically from the familiar areas. So even his marriage to the Midianitess would leave him feeling banished, because he was banished from everybody with whom he had any connection. Now, Midianites were descendants of Keturah, who was Abraham's second wife, who married after the death of Sarah. So they were related to the Israelites, and they seem to have been on good terms with Israel at this point in history. They became enemies of Israel later on, and Gideon had to fight against them. But at this point, they seem to have been on friendly terms with Israel. And so Moses came to the home of Reuel, who we're not sure if he's the same man as Jethro, or whether Jethro was his son, because apparently the expression in Hebrew that tells the connection of Jethro to Moses can mean either father-in-law or son-in-law. So we're not sure which it was. At any rate, Reuel, who was definitely the father of the woman Moses married, and he received him. And by his name, we gather that he was probably a worshiper of the true God, because the construction of his name makes a reference to the God that Israel was supposed to be worshiping, at least, the name of the true God. Those who worship false gods didn't call their gods by that term that is incorporated in his name. So it seems there were little pockets of worshipers of the true God in various places. They were not all together with Israel. Now, do we sometimes feel like strangers in our own country? Because if we do, we would be able to sympathize with Moses. For example, well, do we ever find that we go into stores where so many employees are immigrants and who have such a thick accent we can hardly understand what they're saying, and they can hardly understand us? And you ask, where is this department? Where's this department? They say, what's he saying? And it doesn't make us feel like fish out of water. Well, Moses probably had that kind of feeling in Midian, when we're alone among people who think very differently, with whom we have difficulty to communicate. And we appear ignorant to them because we don't know their ways. And the names that Moses gave to his two sons showed how he felt about living in Midian, because the name he gave to his first son was Gershom, which means exile. And Moses calls him that, saying, I am an exile in a foreign land. And to give his very first son that name showed how preoccupied he was with feeling like an outsider and being considered a nobody. Later on, Moses had another son whom he named Eliezer, which means God is my help. So that with time, Moses came to realize that God had his hand on him, was caring for him. And so he began to think more positively, recognizing that God does all things well. But this was God's opportunity to familiarize Moses with the area of Midian, because that was the area of Sinai. In fact, Moses grazed the flocks of his father-in-law on Mount Sinai. And the Lord, when he called him, he said, the sign that I've really called you to lead these people out of Egypt is that when you get them out of Egypt, they'll worship me right here on this mountain. And they would spend about 1.5 years there at Sinai. But this was where Moses met God as a present reality, not just a God to believe in, but as a living reality, and it made it a sacred place to him. And also, once Moses had led Israel beyond Sinai, he would be in territory that was more unfamiliar to him than ever. But by that time, all he cared about was the glory of God. So here's what Moses said, even before Israel had reached Sinai. He said publicly to Israel, after he had gotten them across the Red Sea, he said, in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he hears your murmurings against the Lord. Who are we that you murmur against us? Yes, he said, who are we, meaning him and Aaron, because he felt like a nobody in himself. But he said, your complaints are against God. So we learn to feel like nobodies when we're estranged from what's nearer to us. But we also feel like nobodies when we must work at a lowly occupation. Moses had to find some way of making a living in Midian, and all he could get was shepherding sheep, serving a man who was a priest but who had large flocks. And I believe that Reuel really was a priest of the true God, even though he wasn't together with Israel. And he had large flocks, and so he hired Moses. Now, it wouldn't be necessary to be able to read and write to take care of sheep. And Moses, according to Stephen, in his speech to the Sanhedrin, he had learned all the knowledge of the Egyptians, so he had an immense education, and certainly he had done a lot of reading and writing. So how would he feel now having to take care of sheep for a living? He'd think that was a lowly occupation. Furthermore, the society, the settled society of the biblical world, tended to look down on shepherds because they lived a nomadic life. So they looked on them as those who can't settle down in one place. They had the same attitude toward them as people in some countries have toward gypsies today, as a people that couldn't be trusted because they wouldn't stay settled in one place. It's somewhat hard for us to grasp that because in our Western society, we tend to sentimentalize shepherds because we've seen pictures of shepherds with their sheep around them and looking at them so tenderly in a way that's heart-touching. And because Christ compared himself with a shepherd, so we tend to lose sight of the fact that in the countries where there is a lot of shepherding, society that's settled tends to look down on shepherds as an irresponsible people. So it would be humiliating for Moses to live in proximity with a people who considered him, they considered shepherds, him included, as an untrustworthy person, whereas as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he certainly had occupied responsible positions in the palace, which would only be given to one who could be trusted. And shepherding was arduous work, according to Jacob's description of it. Remember when Jacob was complaining to Laban about how he worked so hard and was underpaid for it? And he said, "In the daytime the heat consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes." Genesis 31:40. That was Jacob's description of what life as a shepherd was like. That's what Moses had to do now. And a shepherd had to live outdoors in all kinds of weather, and even at night he had to sleep outdoors, because to guard the sheep, he would put them all in the fold that had just a doorway, didn't have a door that could open and close, and then he would sleep across the doorway into the fold. So he was literally the door of the sheepfold. So when Christ said, "I am the door," it was in the context of talking about sheep, because the shepherd literally was the door, and that meant no predator could get into the fold without waking him up. So being nomads, then, shepherds had to live in very simple shelters, either tents or some kind of hut that they could put up quickly. And when Reuel invited Moses to his home and then took him in as part of his family, he was very generous to him, but that was all he could offer him in the way of shelter. But that made Moses a type of Christ, becoming poor for our sakes and comparing himself with the shepherd. And also Christ tasted of society's attitude towards shepherds when he was slighted by people who flocked to him in great numbers to be healed of sickness and to have other temporal needs met, but who weren't interested in repenting of their sin and turning to God. He was slighted by that kind of people. And when people accused Christ of being an impostor, they didn't believe he was their Messiah. Well, a skilled worker always feels uncomfortable not working at what he's trained for. If he has an occupation that requires a lot of mental skill, he may enjoy doing some kind of work that's more physical for a short time to relax his mind, but as a regular occupation, he prefers what he's trained for. And if he has to attempt working at something that requires a skill that he hasn't learned, well, he really feels out of place and therefore like a nobody, like a novice. But when Moses had learned that all glory for our accomplishments was due to God, and that he was serving God by leading Israel to the promised land, well, that's when they built the tabernacle in the desert, and that's when the skills that he had learned in Egypt probably proved very useful. So we tend to feel like nobodies when we're estranged from what's familiar to us, and when we must work at a lowly occupation. We also tend to feel like nobodies when we feel not appreciated. Moses went to sit by a well, which was frequently a gathering place for the community, because everybody lived out in the country and was surrounded by fields, but the well was where people came for water, and so it was a gathering place. And that was where he hoped to find somebody who would help him find a way to live, or he might meet some kind person who would take him in. But having had great wealth at his command in Egypt, he was now at the mercy of some such kind person who would receive him, but ultimately depending on the Lord. And Reuel's 7 daughters were shepherdesses, but that was something unusual. Usually, girls didn't become shepherdesses unless their father had no sons, or if he had sons, they were grown up and had left home, or maybe he had sons who weren't old enough yet for the work of shepherding. But otherwise, girls just didn't become shepherdesses. And quarrels over water were frequent in those lands because of the heat and the dryness. So there was a shortage of water, and it was common for groups of shepherds to quarrel with one another over water. In fact, that explains why so soon, when God had gotten Israel out of Egypt, and they needed water, and Moses strikes the rock to provide an abundance of water. And so soon after God had provided that abundance of water, the Amalekites came and attacked them because it was common to quarrel over water. So the Amalekites heard that they had an abundance of water. They wanted to come tell them, where do you get that water? Show it to us. And that led to a war. So, well, that was what was happening here. And we gather from verses 18 and 19 that this was a usual experience for Reuel's daughters, that they would have to wait for the male shepherds of the area to water their flocks first, and then take what water was left for them. In other words, the male shepherds bullied the shepherdesses because they were not as strong. So Moses was a gentleman toward those 7 girls who were shepherdesses because he came to their rescue. Just how he managed to defend them is not told us, because after all, he was only one man against a group of shepherds or groups of shepherds. Perhaps we gather from his killing the Egyptian that he was an extra strong man. And it might also be that because he had been an Egyptian prince, he carried some kind of weapon with him with which he could have frightened the male shepherds away, and therefore watered the flocks of Reuel's daughters, or shepherdesses. And Moses certainly wasn't thinking of himself here. In fact, he didn't even ask for a drink. Apparently, according to custom, it would have been a legitimate thing to do, because people came to draw water at the well would have containers, but somebody who was just a passerby wouldn't. So we could ask somebody who had a container, could you draw me some water and give me a drink? And we find different people, like the servant of Abraham, for example, benefiting from that custom. But we don't find Moses even asking for a drink of water. His mind was just on helping those 7 shepherdesses. So it's evident that Moses had a compassionate heart for those who were weak, if they were, and especially if they were being bullied. And even though he had acted rashly in killing the Egyptian, his motive had been the very same: his compassion for the slave that Egyptian was beating. And it was for that same reason that he had tried to make peace between the 2 Jews who were arguing and having a fight. And for the same reason that he came to the rescue of these 7 girls caring for sheep. So he had taken to heart, when we can't do all the good that we would like to do, we must do all the good we can. But these 7 girls apparently didn't show any sign of appreciating what Moses had done for them, how he had rescued them from the male shepherds, enabled them to get their work done so early in the day because they were able to water their flocks so soon. It seems that they just took their flocks, and maybe if they had water jars with them that they took with them, and then just went home. And they thought Moses was an Egyptian, doubtless because he had Egyptian clothes on, they had a particular costume, and perhaps also his speech revealed that he was used to speaking Egyptian. And they might have thought that due to his princely clothes, he was great enough to fend for himself. Those are possibilities. At any rate, when they got back home, their father asked them, how come you come home so early? And they told us an Egyptian came to our rescue, and their father was really not happy with them. He said, why didn't you bring that man home? So it's clear that according to custom, they should have brought him home. After all, people in the Middle East in the biblical times were usually very hospitable, even to strangers who they thought might be in need. And he asked them, why didn't you bring him home? Well, some have suggested that the 7 girls didn't bring Moses home because it would have been contrary to their ideas of propriety to invite him home without permission from their father first. But verse 20 doesn't back that idea up, because their father said clearly to them, you should have brought him home. Well, Moses probably felt slighted until he received this invitation to go to Reuel's home. Up till that point, he felt treated like a nobody. But yet God didn't abandon Moses, because he laid it on Reuel's heart to treat him kindly and to take him in. So now Moses became Reuel's employee, and he tended his flocks. So now Moses had job security and everything he needed, and a family. And by his initially being treated like a nobody, Moses tasted what Christ experienced when he was slighted, and he learned what it was to seek to serve rather than to be served, like Christ came to do. So we learn to feel like nobodies then when we're estranged from what is familiar to us, and when we must work at a lowly occupation. Furthermore, when we feel not appreciated, and we also tend to feel like nobodies when we're bored. And I think Moses was bored when he was tending the sheep. There's reason to think so, because he was attracted to the burning bush from which the Lord wanted to speak to him. And he was attracted to it because it kept burning and never got burned up. But to notice that that bush wasn't getting burned up, he must have paid attention, but for an extended time, because burning bushes were a common sight in that desert. It was such a dry climate that bushes burned up quickly, or dried out quickly, and the slightest spark would light them on fire. And there were numerous natural causes that could produce small sparks, and the smallest spark was the light of bush on fire. So they were a common sight, and it would be necessary to pay attention to one burning bush for an extended time to notice that it wasn't getting burned up. Well, people tend to pay attention to trivial things when they're bored, because there just isn't anything exciting or interesting going on. I saw that happen at a time when I lived out in the country, about 3 miles from the nearest hamlet, that would hardly even be called a town, because all there was to it was 2 general stores, 2 garages, and a school with 2 classrooms in it, and the houses where people who worked at those places lived. And so in that community, well, I visited in many homes, and in every one of those homes, whenever people heard the sound of a car coming down the road, they'd run to the window to see who was going by. And they knew all the cars in the community and their owners by heart. So every time a car went by, they knew who was going to town or who was going that way. In a big city, did you ever see people run to the window because they hear the noise of a car coming along? But it shows how people pay attention to trivial things when they're bored, because there's not much going on. Well, that's what makes me think Moses was bored tending sheep. And after all, we can understand that if you learned all the knowledge of the Egyptians, so we had an extensive education, and the Egyptians were very skillful in many sciences, and they wrote a number of books, and they had a great number of different skills. So Moses had learned all that, and now he has to do a job that a person could do without even learning to read and write, and it would be always the same. The person who had always been used to that life might find it enjoyable enough, but with the background of Moses. But as in Moses' case, God often puts his people in situations where not much of earthly events are going on, and life seems somewhat kind of monotonous in order to get their attention. And in such circumstances, we tend to think, is this kind of life all that I'm any good for? Am I that useless? And so we feel like nobodies. But instead, it's God inviting us to spend time alone with him, take advantage of the opportunity to be alone with God and commune with him. And that's how one gets to know God well, as Moses did. This was the beginning of it. And Moses got to know God as nobody else has ever known him on earth. But this was the beginning of such an acquaintance with God. When storms of life are around me beating, when rough the path that I have trod, inside my closet door retreating, I love to be alone with God. What though the clouds be gathered o'er me? What though I've passed beneath the rod? God's perfect will there lies before me when I am thus alone with God. 'Tis there I find new strength for duty, as o'er the sands of time I plod. I see the King in all his beauty while resting there alone with God. And when I see the moment nearing, when I shall sleep beneath the sod, when time with me is disappearing, I want to be alone with God. Alone with God, the world forbidden. Alone with God, O blessed retreat. Alone with God and in him hidden, to hold with him communion sweet. And if God puts us through a monotonous experience, monotonous period in our lives, and we feel bored, it isn't that God considers us useless or not good for anything more interesting than that. Rather, he considers us so precious that he wants to bring us near to himself. So he gives us an opportunity to spend time alone with us and get to know him well. So if God puts us through an experience that makes us feel like nobodies, it isn't in order to discourage us or to depress us, and certainly not to make us feel useless. And therefore, let us certainly not take such an experience as an excuse not to do anything for God. But rather, let's remember that learning to be nobody is expected to keep us mindful of our absolute dependence on God. Because Christ said, apart from me, you can do nothing. But we also read, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We learn to feel like nobodies when we're estranged from everything familiar to us. We also feel like nobodies when we must work at a lowly occupation. And we feel like nobodies when we're not appreciated. And furthermore, we feel like nobodies when we're bored. But when we feel that way, let it serve as a reminder of our total dependence on the Lord, coupled with what great works he wants to do with us as instruments in our hands. Only to be what he wants me to be, every moment of every day. Yielded completely to Jesus alone, every step of this pilgrim way. Just to be clay in the potter's hands, willing to do what his will commands. Only to be what he wants me to be, every moment of every day. And God may put us through a time of learning to feel or learning to be nobody for exactly that purpose. Our blessed Lord, it's our desire that we should be exactly what thou desires for us to be, and that we should serve thy purpose. Often there are many attitudes that thou findest necessary to get out of us. Before that, especially to teach us that we can't do anything without Christ, but with them, we can do anything that is thy will. And if it takes experiences that may make us feel lonely or unappreciated or bored, we would submit to them in order that we can learn this dependence on thee that we will need for thy service. And may the life of Christ in us be what shows as we serve by thy power.